right, let's move on to the role of agents, which I think is most of your practice, at least for most of your careers. The four big CBAs are unique in that there are multiple employers as well as multiple layers of bargaining. First, the union negotiates with all of the employers collectively as opposed to an individual team. Then, agents who are certified by the union negotiate an individual's player's contract with that team. Based on your personal experiences, what are your thoughts on this arrangement, and how much involvement does the union really have once you're at the stage of negotiating an individual player contract with that team?
Both are great questions. I'm sure everyone of us will want to talk about it, but I think, to answer the latter part of your question in terms of what role does the Players Association actually have in a negotiation, I would say the answer to that question is minimal. There is a perception out there that the Players Association picks up the phone and says, don't agree to that deal or don't do any of those things. And I can tell you in 20 plus years of working as an agent, I never once got a phone call from any Players Association when I was doing multiple sports, and certainly in baseball over the last several years. The only phone call I ever got was, do you need any assistance? Do you need any help? Does the player have any questions? So I don't think the unions, at least not in my experience, really get hands-on in terms of what the contract negotiation is. Now, with salary arbitration, they do get a little bit more involved because obviously, again, if you think about the union's role is to protect all of the players in their sport. So certainly any sport, whether it be hockey or baseball, that has an arbitration system for determining player salaries, is going to have an interest in making sure those arbitration cases are handled properly and trying to maximize the information that's put in front of the arbitrators, because there's such a direct impact on so many other salaries. So that part, I do think that the unions really don't get that involved on the day-to-day contract negotiations, except to make sure the information is being disseminated to all the other agents so they're aware of what player contracts are and what players are signing quickly when sometimes players' contracts are being agreed to. Just in general about the role of the agent, and I in my introduction I forgot to say that I'm an adjunct professor here as well, in addition to Caleb, and I do a course on athletes and agents. And I think it's an important one because I think the role of the agent has certainly changed in the 20 plus years that I served in that capacity for a player, where it went from initially more of a contract negotiation role to a much broader role and being involved in more aspects and more parts of their professional career and personal lives. And I think that's the one thing that the agents really need to be mindful of who are still practicing, as these unions, and properly so, are being more interested in protecting the players that they represent and perhaps having a little bit more stringent requirements for agents. We've seen the Major League Baseball Players Association revise their agent regulations. All of these changes are for one reason and one reason only. It's what I say, to sort of clean up the scum factor a little bit that's in the agent industry, and more importantly, try and protect the players that the unions represent. So I think that's certainly an important aspect of the role of the agent, is that the agent issue is evolving and players associations becoming much more involved with regulations and authority to discipline the agents that they oversee.
Right. I think, as Gregg stated, the union's role is to protect the players. Realize that it's not a right to be an agent. You're given the chance by the union. They will certify you to become an agent. You have no specific right to represent players within any given professional, one of the big four sports in the United States. So the main role that players associations have with regards to agents actually comes through the certification process and then the regulation as to what agents can and cannot do, and then disciplining those agents if they decide to do so based on any egregious act by those particular agents. So first, certification, as I mentioned, it's a privilege, it's not a right. If you look at this past year, when there was the whole issue with the NFL lockout, the NFL Players Association did not certify any new agents. So first of all, if you want to become an NFLPA contract advisor, you have to apply in January. You cannot apply in any other month throughout the year. You pay your fee, you go for a test in Washington, D.C. You have to go to the required meeting. If you pass the test, you can then represent players for the next draft. It is quite a process. So remember, certification is a huge role, and now with the MLBPA's new regulations, there's new types of agents, not only these general agents, but limited certification for agents who don't negotiate the contracts, but may be involved in recruiting or providing some other type of service. And then there's the disciplinary actions that the players associations can take if an agent is found to violate any of the rules within the regulations of the Players Associations that they provide to all agents. So those are the two areas. Enforcement of those regulations has not necessarily been there in the past few years, but perhaps that changes in the immediate future.
You said the agents have to be certified by the Players Association. What about the runners?
Baseball, yes, that's one of the changes that Darren was just referring to.
The runners are as well?
Yeah, anyone basically now, from a marketing person to a runner, anything like that, now has to have a minimum of what they call a limited certification. And the interesting aspect of the limited certification is that limited certification is underneath the umbrella of the registered agent. So now in the past, you used to have the registered agent would go, I don't know him, he's just an intern, he's just helping me out. I'm not responsible for his actions. And with the Players Association in baseball has said, that's not going to work anymore. Now you're going to get in trouble if someone's working for you and they don't have the limited certification, number one. And number two, if they do have a limited certification, they break the rules, it's your responsibility.
Is that the same in basketball?
Not the same, no. Now, basketball, they have not revised those in a long time.
Right.
And obviously, baseball, this was the most recent, just about 12 months ago when they passed these new regulations. So, and again, we have not seen any enforcement of the new regulations yet, as Darren said, and that's going to be an interesting thing. Like all of us know, a law or a rule is only as good as the enforcement of that law or rule. So it's going to be interesting to see if there's any efforts that are made to specifically discipline some of the licensed agents for the actions of their limited certified people.
And I think there's an interesting loophole there, because as Gregg mentioned, the runner will be certified under an agent. So what if that runner is not with a particular agent, but works for a variety of agents and does not sign an employment agreement, or not even an independent contractor agreement? How do you regulate that? So.
Awesome.
On football, there's a proposal out there now where kind of third-party service providers for the agent would be similar to baseball. So that hopefully will help, but it's an issue. And I think, as Darren noted, there are a number of loopholes. I think if the leagues decided to enforce the current rules they have in effect, I think they could close a lot of loopholes with current regulations. I think the problem is, as Gregg noted, your rules are only as good as your ability to enforce. So I think that's ultimately what you're going to run into. I think that there are a number of people involved in every one of these athletes' lives that potentially you'd want to have registered, and then it becomes a slippery slope. I mean, you start registering all the financial advisors, which you do in football. You have to register those, but you start registering athlete trainers and things like that. I mean, there's a number of people that recruit athletes that are involved in their day-to-day lives that you could go down that road with. And to add on the kind of the role of agent, I agree with Gregg too. I never had and I haven't been doing it as long as Gregg, but I've never had a union call me and advise me or give me help with a particular contract negotiation. Now, they do have a lot of information, so I think the information's there to where if you're trying to find salary information for a kind of a comparative analysis, that can help. So they do have a lot of tools that can help, but they're not necessarily going to go out of their way, nor is it their job really to go out of their way to help you. That, I guess, is really all I wanted to add to that.
Okay, to build off that, though, regarding communication from the union to the agents, think about the most recent football lockout, and overnight, suddenly, there's a new deal. How is that communicated to the NFL agents? So they're prepared when there's a sudden land rush for players, and you don't necessarily know what all the terms and conditions are of that CBA.
If you don't mind, I had firsthand experience with this with this year's draft, and then you have real gray area as to what agents are allowed to do and teams are allowed to do during the lockout. If your player is part of the union, you're subject to a lockout, and you're technically not allowed to talk to management and coaches. Now, there was a lot of that going on that everyone knows about. Was there discipline of that? Sometimes. There's been some discipline, but it's been limited. But then what do you do when the draft occurs and then you have the issues of your players starting to worry about getting ready and learning the playbook, for example? Well, I think, the NFL draft was 3 days. So players drafted on day one got the playbook. Players drafted on days 2 and 3 didn't, technically. I mean, there were players that got it, but days 2 and 3, you weren't supposed to have the playbook. And then undrafted players, you received calls at the end of the draft indicating that 4 or 5 teams wanted to take their player when the lockout ended. Well, as an advisor to a player, what are you supposed to do with that information? You have no contract, your player's not protected. I mean, the team, again, holds all the cards. They can rescind that offer when the lockout's lifted. And then when the lockout is lifted, what are the new rules, I think, to your point? And I think, thinking back, we got emails. I would get emailed. You'd follow blogs and folks that wrote on this, which was pretty good information. I mean, ESPN and some of those news outlets had information, I think, that was very helpful, but you really didn't know until you heard from the union or the association at that time, and then you'd get an email that, 24 hours you're going to have a lift. You don't really know the parameters, what you can negotiate, what your deal points are, and then teams start calling the next day, and you try to do the best you can and work through it.
I think the other interesting thing, Caleb, too, which I'm sure you had to deal with, was technically, as everyone knows, and Darren was describing earlier on, was the NBA might go down that path, but in the NFL, through the decertification process, which they instituted almost simultaneously with the expiration of the contract, technically there was no union. So it was a challenging thing because technically if there was no union, there was no certification process that was in effect. So there are really no certified agents, in addition to being no certification of a bargaining representative in the NFL. So that was another challenge that I think the NFL agents had to face.
Well, we didn't pay dues, but then as soon as they were back to a union again, we got a bill statement. So, that it is what it is in terms of how that worked out. But it was. I think the union, they were charged. They had a difficult task. Players wanted to get back on the field. Teams wanted to get back on the field, and at the end, things moved very quickly. And I think quicker than everyone in that negotiating room anticipated. But it did leave us with some challenges. I remember getting calls. I think the lockout was lifted on a Tuesday, so we got calls Tuesday afternoon from teams, but we couldn't sign the players still. They lifted the bar on communication, but you couldn't sign. So you would have communications for 6 hours, and then you're still not left with a deal. No signed agreement. And as Gregg probably knows, without a signed agreement, you don't have a deal. So you may have a deal on Tuesday, and then Wednesday when you can sign, that deal's off the table. And you had a lot of that, which I think impacted a lot of players. But an interesting note is more undrafted, free agents made rosters this year than any other year. And I know in looking through some of our materials that we exchanged, there were questions as to how undrafted players fared with the NFL lockout. Surprising to me, they fared pretty well. But I was surprised by that because they really had a lot to overcome.
Well, and sticking on the point of the Players Association no longer being a union, becoming a trade association, I also found it a little odd. I received some of those emails, and it sort of seemed like they were still acting as a union. They tried to turn one of the typically optional meetings into a mandatory meeting, and then once the lockout was settled, there was an optional meeting in Chicago where they went over the fact that now all the agents that were certified prior to the lockout had limited certification until they paid another fee. They wanted more of that money and the liability insurance. But another interesting part of the whole situation of the Players Association decertifying was that it took grievances out of the mandatory arbitration system. So you had a case where a particular player agent had a first-round pick out of the University of North Carolina, who up until a few days prior to the draft was signed to that agent and then switched. And there was a dispute as to whether he can recoup any of the money that he forwarded to that player for training, living expenses, etc., and whether he was entitled to any percentage of the negotiations of the contract. Actually, it wasn't before the draft, it was after the draft, but prior to negotiating that contract. Typically, that would be subject to mandatory arbitration through the Players Association system. But because of the fact that the Players Association had decertified and the players switched during that time, that agent was able to bring his case in a court of law. And without decertification, that would not have been the case.